The strangest thing about the German prisoners wasn't that they feared Americans. It was that they didn't understand why Americans smiled so much. The truck rolled into Dawson County just after 5 in the afternoon, its tires dragging long ribbons of dust across the Texas road, while the late summer heat shimmered above the fields like invisible fire. Inside the back sat 12 German POWs in faded uniforms, quiet as church shadows, their faces pale beneath the grime of travel. Some stared down at their boots. Others watched the horizon through the slats in silence. None of them understood the noise waiting ahead. Sergeant Thomas Reed rode in the passenger seat with one elbow resting against the window frame, his tan hat pulled low against the sun. 26 years old, born outside Fort Worth, raised around cattle, dust storms, and Sunday sermons. He had guarded German prisoners for 8 months now, and he still didn't trust how calm they always looked, especially Carl Weber. Carl sat near the tailgate with his hands folded together, posture straight despite the rough road. He looked older than 30, though Thomas knew he wasn't. War had a way of carving years into a man without asking permission. As the truck passed the edge of town, the first sound drifted through the air. Music, faint at first, then louder. A steel guitar, fast clapping, cheers rolling across the open land like distant thunder. One of the younger POWs frowned. Another glanced toward Carl. Thomas noticed it immediately. Germans always looked confused by loud happiness. The truck turned past a grain elevator, then crossed the narrow bridge toward the rodeo grounds. Red, white, and blue flags snapped in the hot wind above wooden fences. Pickup trucks lined the field for nearly half a mile. Kids ran between the parked cars carrying lemonade and paper flags while men in denim shirts hammered signs into the dirt. Somewhere nearby, a horse kicked against a trailer gate. The prisoners stared at everything without speaking. Thomas expected resentment, maybe bitterness, but what he saw instead looked closer to disbelief. One little boy stopped near the truck and pointed directly at the Germans. His mother quickly lowered his hand and guided him away. Carl watched them disappear into the crowd. Then his eyes lifted toward the rodeo arena where several cowboys rode circles beneath the evening light, dust rising around them like smoke. The cheering grew louder. The Germans exchanged uncertain looks. Emil Hartmann, the youngest prisoner in the group, leaned slightly toward Carl and muttered something in German under his breath. Carl answered quietly without taking his eyes off the arena. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the expression. Confusion. Pure confusion. Because none of this made sense to men raised in the middle of war. Americans were supposed to be hard, suspicious, angry. Instead, there were children laughing beside food stands, old men carrying coffee cups, women in summer dresses waving fans against the heat, music floating through the air like there wasn't a war happening on the other side of the ocean. The truck finally stopped beside a long wooden fence near the livestock pens. Dust drifted slowly around the wheels. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas stepped down first, boots crunching against dry gravel. He opened the rear gate and motioned toward the prisoners. "All right, boys," he said evenly. "Welcome to your first Texas rodeo." And for the first time since arriving in America, Carl Weber looked completely speechless. The smell reached them first. Charcoal smoke, roasted corn, fresh coffee drifting through the warm evening air while the Texas sun lowered itself behind the arena lights. The prisoners stood beside the livestock fence under armed supervision, but the scene around them looked nothing like the war they had imagined America would be fighting. Children ran past carrying striped paper cups filled with lemonade. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled with swing music between bursts of static. Men in worn cowboy hats leaned against wooden rails discussing cattle prices like the entire world had not been tearing itself apart overseas. Carl Weber rested both hands against the rough fence and watched a rider circle the arena at an easy pace. The horse moved with calm confidence, muscles rolling beneath its chestnut coat, while dust floated through the golden light around its legs. Carl said nothing, but Thomas Reed noticed how closely he watched the animal. "You rode before?" Thomas asked. Carl turned slightly, surprised the guard had spoken directly to him. "Not like this," he answered in careful English. "But my father worked with draft horses." His voice carried a tired softness that did not match the image Thomas had built in his mind over the last several months. Before Thomas could respond, An older man approached from the nearby food stand balancing 4 tin coffee cups in his hands. Earl Cooper, 62 years old, lean as fence wire, sunburned neck. Dust permanently worked into the creases of his boots. He handed one cup to Thomas, then looked directly at the prisoners. "Hot evening," he said casually. The Germans exchanged uncertain glances. Cooper extended the remaining cups toward them without hesitation. Thomas frowned immediately. "Sir, regulations do not exactly encourage social visits." Cooper ignored him. "Coffee is not a social visit, son. Coffee is coffee." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Emil slowly accepted one of the cups with both hands like he expected someone to snatch it away. Steam curled upward into the evening air. Carl accepted another after a pause, nodding politely. "Thank you," he said. Cooper simply shrugged. "You boys are a long way from home." Thomas watched the exchange carefully. No fear, no hatred, just 3 tired men standing near a rodeo arena while music drifted through the dust. It unsettled him more than anger would have. Across the grounds, the announcer tested the loudspeaker. His deep voice echoed over the crowd while workers hurried to prepare the arena gates. The excitement around the rodeo grew stronger by the minute. Pickup headlights flickered on one by one as dusk settled over the county fairgrounds. Women spread blankets near the fence line. Teenagers laughed beside the concession stand. Somewhere behind the livestock pens, a horse let out a sharp whinny followed by the metallic rattle of a trailer gate. Emil looked around slowly, still holding the coffee cup close to his chest. "There are so many people," he said quietly. Thomas glanced toward him. "It is Saturday night." Emil nodded once, almost to himself. In Germany now, Saturday nights are very quiet. The sentence hung there longer than anyone expected. Even Cooper stopped smiling for a moment, because suddenly the war felt very far away and very close at the same time. Thomas took a slow sip of coffee while studying the prisoners again. He realized something uncomfortable then. None of these men looked dangerous standing beneath the rodeo lights. They looked exhausted, young, homesick, human. A burst of cheering suddenly exploded from the arena as the first rider entered the gate at full speed. The Germans instinctively turned toward the sound. Their expressions changed instantly. Confusion mixed with fascination. The cowboy leaned low over the saddle while the crowd stomped and shouted with pure excitement. Emil blinked in disbelief. Carl narrowed his eyes toward the arena, dust swirling beneath the floodlights. Then, almost under his breath, he asked the question none of them could understand. Why do Americans cheer for danger? Thomas looked toward the roaring crowd, the flags snapping overhead, the riders chasing glory inside the dirt ring beneath the fading Texas sky. After a long silence, he answered honestly. Sometimes cheering is how people forget the world for a little while. The night air cooled slowly after sunset, but the rodeo grounds still carried the warmth of the day inside the dirt, the wooden fences, and the metal rails glowing beneath rows of yellow floodlights. Music drifted through the fairgrounds while people packed shoulder to shoulder near the arena entrance holding popcorn bags, coffee cups, and folded blankets for the evening events. The German prisoners remained near the livestock pens under supervision, though the atmosphere around them had softened in a way Thomas Reed could not ignore. Earlier that year, most towns would have stared at prisoners with suspicion alone. Here, people mostly stared with curiosity. A little girl with blonde curls paused near the fence beside Carl Weber and pointed toward his uniform before her father gently guided her away. Carl watched them disappear into the crowd without expression, but Thomas noticed the small change in his eyes. Less guarded now, less distant. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted heavily while stable hands brushed dust from its saddle. Emil Hartmann stood close to the rail studying every movement inside the pens with quiet fascination. "They trust animals this large around so many people?" he asked softly. Thomas leaned one shoulder against the fence beside him. "Around here, people trust horses more than automobiles." Emil looked genuinely puzzled by that answer. It made Thomas almost smile. Across the grounds, Earl Cooper argued cheerfully with 2 ranchers over whose steer would win the next competition. Laughter rolled through the warm Texas night while strings of carnival lights flickered overhead. The Germans followed the sounds carefully, like men listening to a language they still did not fully understand. Because none of this matched what they had been told America looked like. There were no ruined streets here. No frightened civilians rushing toward shelters. No hollow silence hanging over exhausted cities. Just music, dust, laughter, fried food, children chasing each other between parked trucks beneath a sky full of stars. Carl slowly lifted the coffee cup Cooper had given him earlier, now gone lukewarm in his hands. "This place feels strange," he admitted quietly. Thomas glanced toward him. "Texas usually does." Carl shook his head once. "No. I mean," he searched for the English words carefully. "People here still know how to enjoy being alive." The sentence landed harder than Thomas expected. For several seconds he said nothing at all, because suddenly he realized something uncomfortable. He had spent months assuming every German prisoner carried the same thoughts, the same loyalties, the same anger. But standing beneath the rodeo lights, Carl Weber did not look like an enemy officer from a war poster. He looked like a tired man trying to remember what ordinary life felt like. A burst of applause thundered from the arena as another rider completed his run. The crowd erupted with whistles and cheers loud enough to shake dust from the wooden beams overhead. Emil flinched slightly at the noise before looking toward Thomas again. "Americans clap for everything," he said. Thomas finally laughed under his breath. "Pretty much." Nearby, one of the younger prisoners stared openly at a teenage boy carrying 2 giant paper trays stacked with barbecue sandwiches. "How much food do Americans eat?" he muttered in German. Carl answered him quietly, and for the first time Thomas heard amusement in their voices instead of caution. The change felt small, almost invisible, but it was there. A woman working near the lemonade stand glanced toward the prisoners for a moment before walking over with a tray of fresh biscuits wrapped in cloth. Thomas straightened immediately, surprised. "Ma'am, you do not have to do that." "I know I do not," she answered simply. She offered the tray toward the prisoners with calm politeness. But nobody should stand around hungry at a rodeo. The Germans hesitated again. Carl accepted one carefully. Emil followed after him. The woman nodded once and returned toward the crowd without another word. Thomas watched the exchange in silence while rodeo music echoed across the grounds. No speeches, no grand gestures, just a tray of warm biscuits shared beneath old floodlights in the middle of wartime Texas. Carl looked down at the food in his hands for several seconds before speaking quietly enough that only Thomas heard him. "Back home," he said, "people do not share this easily anymore." Thomas looked out toward the packed arena glowing beneath the night sky, then toward the prisoners standing quietly beside him. Somewhere in the distance, the announcer called for the next event while horses stamped against the dirt and the crowd leaned forward with excitement. And for the first time all evening, Thomas stopped seeing guards and prisoners standing on opposite sides of the fence. He only saw men far away from home listening to the same music drift through the Texas dark. The rodeo announcer's voice rolled across the grounds like thunder softened by distance, while floodlights painted the arena in pale gold against the dark Texas sky. More people had gathered now. Families filled the wooden bleachers shoulder to shoulder, boots resting against dusty rails while children waved small paper flags and leaned dangerously far forward every time a horse burst through the gate. The German prisoners remained near the livestock fence under Thomas Reed's supervision, but nobody paid much attention to them anymore. That alone felt strange. Earlier in the war, Thomas had seen crowds spit near prisoners without even hiding their anger. Tonight, the people of Dawson County seemed too busy enjoying themselves to hold on to hate every second. Music drifted through the night air between bursts of cheering. Somewhere nearby, grease popped from the fry stands while the smell of barbecue smoke lingered over the grounds like a blanket. Carl Weber rested his forearms against the top rail and watched the arena with careful focus. Every movement, every rider, every horse. Thomas noticed he studied things the way mechanics studied engines. Quietly, completely. "You really have never seen anything like this?" Thomas asked. Carl shook his head slowly. No, his eyes stayed fixed on the arena lights. In Germany, festivals are different. More organized. More, he searched for the word. Controlled. A sudden roar of laughter exploded from the bleachers after one cowboy nearly lost his hat during a turn around the arena barrel. Carl blinked in surprise at how hard people laughed over something so small. Emil stood beside him holding another cup of coffee Cooper had quietly brought over earlier. The younger prisoner looked overwhelmed by everything at once. "They laugh very loudly," Emil murmured. Thomas smirked faintly. That is because you are in Texas. Before Emil could answer, movement near the lower fence caught everyone's attention. A small blonde girl, maybe 7 years old, had wandered too close to the livestock area while clutching a red ribbon in one hand. She stared through the rails at the horses with complete fascination while her mother struggled through the crowded aisle several yards away. One of the stable horses shifted suddenly against the fence, not violently, just enough to startle the child backward. She stumbled near the rail and froze. Instantly, Carl stepped forward. Without thinking. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just calm. Steady. He crouched slightly near the fence line and spoke in a low voice Thomas could barely hear. Easy now, Carl said gently. Do not run. The little girl looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Carl slowly extended the red ribbon she had dropped near the dirt without crossing the barrier between them. You forgot this. The child hesitated only a second before reaching out and taking it from his hand. At that same moment, her mother finally rushed over, breathless from panic. Thomas expected fear the instant she realized her daughter stood inches away from a German prisoner. Instead, the woman simply pulled the girl close and looked directly at Carl. Thank you, she said sincerely. Carl nodded once. Of course. Then the woman disappeared back into the crowd, carrying her daughter against her side. The entire moment lasted less than 20 seconds. But Thomas felt something shift anyway, because Carl had reacted before the guards did, before anyone else moved. Not as a prisoner, not as a soldier, just as a man seeing a frightened child too close to danger. Emil watched the crowd disappear again before quietly speaking in German to Carl. Thomas did not understand the words, but he heard the softness in Carl's reply. Across the arena, another event began beneath the floodlights while the crowd stomped their boots against the wooden stands in excitement. Yet Thomas barely noticed the noise now. He kept replaying the image of the little girl accepting the ribbon from Carl's hand without fear. Back at the prison camp, fences divided every conversation before it could even begin. Here, beneath old rodeo lights and drifting Texas dust, those lines suddenly felt thinner than they had a few hours ago. Earl Cooper wandered back, over carrying a paper sack of roasted peanuts tucked beneath one arm. You boys settling in all right? He asked casually. One of the German prisoners looked genuinely confused. You speak to us like guests. Cooper adjusted his hat against the warm night breeze. Son, tonight everybody here is just trying to enjoy themselves before Monday morning shows up again. Carl looked out toward the arena where another rider disappeared into a cloud of dust beneath roaring applause. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he said something Thomas would remember long after the war ended. Maybe that is why America feels so different, Carl murmured. People here still believe tomorrow will come. The night deepened over Dawson County while the rodeo lights burned brighter against the dark Texas sky, turning the drifting dust silver each time the arena gates swung open. The crowd had settled into the comfortable rhythm of the evening now. Boots against wooden bleachers, coffee steaming in paper cups, laughter rolling through the warm air between bursts of applause. The German prisoners remained near the fence line beneath Sergeant Thomas Reed's watch, though the tension from earlier had almost disappeared completely. People passed by them without fear now. Some barely looked twice. Others nodded politely, as if the strange sight of German POWs at a Texas rodeo had somehow become normal over the course of a single evening. Carl Weber stood quietly beside the livestock pens watching workers guide horses toward the next event. He seemed calmer than before, though his eyes never stopped observing the details around him. The arena lights reflected faintly against the dust on his worn boots while country music drifted across the grounds from a nearby radio. Emil Hartmann leaned against the fence beside him, holding a small paper sack of roasted peanuts Cooper had given him earlier. I still do not understand why everyone is smiling, Emil admitted softly. Carl glanced toward the packed grandstands where hundreds of strangers sat shoulder to shoulder cheering for riders they had never met. Maybe they need it, Carl answered. People forget fear for a few hours. Thomas overheard the conversation while adjusting the brim of his hat against the breeze. He wanted to disagree, wanted to remind them that Americans were not simple people hiding from reality behind rodeos and music. But the longer the evening lasted, the harder it became to explain what exactly made this place feel different. Because the truth was difficult to put into words. The people here understood the war existed. Sons had left these same dusty roads wearing uniforms. Telegrams still arrived. Mothers still waited by kitchen windows. Yet somehow, on a Saturday night beneath bright arena lights, the town chose joy anyway. Suddenly, a loud burst of noise erupted near the center gates. The announcer's voice rose with excitement as workers hurried across the dirt arena preparing for the next competition. Horses shifted nervously behind the holding fences while cowboys adjusted gloves and tightened saddle straps beneath the floodlights. The energy across the crowd changed instantly. People leaned forward in anticipation. Children climbed onto the rails for a better view. Even Emil straightened slightly beside the fence. "What happens now?" he asked. Thomas folded his arms. "Bull riding." Emil frowned in confusion. "They ride bulls on purpose?" Before Thomas could answer, the arena gate swung open and a rider burst into the dirt ring atop a massive bull, moving with raw strength and wild energy. The crowd exploded into cheers loud enough to shake the wooden stands beneath their boots. Dust spiraled beneath the floodlights while the rider fought to stay balanced for several intense seconds before finally sliding safely off near the fence line. The audience roared with approval. Emil stared openly in disbelief. "Americans are insane," he whispered. Thomas laughed before he could stop himself. Nearby, even Carl allowed the smallest trace of amusement to appear at the corner of his mouth. Another rider prepared near the gate while the announcer shouted statistics into the microphone. The smell of dust, leather, sweat, and roasted peanuts mixed beneath the warm night air. Then, without warning, one of the younger stable horses near the side pens jerked nervously against its rope after being startled by the crowd noise. Several people nearby stepped back instinctively. Nothing dangerous happened, but the sudden movement caused a small wave of confusion near the fence line where families stood watching. A little boy lost his balance near the rail while trying to see over the crowd. Before Thomas even reacted, Carl reached out calmly and steadied the child with one hand against his shoulder. Gentle, immediate. The boy looked up at him with surprise. Carl simply nodded once before letting go. "Careful there," he said quietly in accented English. The child's father turned quickly, concern flashing across his face for half a second before he realized what happened. Then something unexpected crossed the man's expression instead. "Gratitude. Appreciate it," he said sincerely. Carl stepped back without answering. The father guided his son away through the crowd while the rodeo announcer continued shouting over the speakers, and another wave of applause thundered through the arena. Thomas stared at Carl for several long seconds afterward. Not because the moment had been dramatic. It was not. Most people probably never even noticed it happened. But that was exactly why it stayed with him. Carl never looked around for recognition, never tried to impress anyone. He simply reacted whenever someone needed help, as naturally as breathing. Earl Cooper wandered over again, carrying another pot of coffee balanced carefully in one weathered hand. "Funny thing about nights like this," he said while pouring cups beneath the glow of the floodlights. Thomas glanced toward him. "What is that?" Cooper looked out across the packed rodeo grounds where cowboys, ranchers, children, soldiers, and German prisoners all stood beneath the same drifting Texas dust. "People stop acting like symbols," he said quietly, "and start acting like people again." By 9 o'clock, the rodeo grounds felt like their own small world separated from the war by little more than music and dust. Floodlights hummed overhead while moths circled the bright glass in endless patterns. The arena announcer continued calling out names with the same excitement he had used all evening, and each burst of applause rolled across the Texas night like waves hitting a shoreline. Near the livestock fence, Thomas Reed loosened his collar slightly against the lingering heat while the German prisoners stood quietly beside him. Earlier in the evening, he had watched them with constant suspicion. Now he found himself watching them differently. Not because he trusted them completely, but because nothing about this night matched the picture he once carried in his head. Carl Weber stood near the wooden rail with his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, studying a pair of ranch hands preparing equipment near the holding gates. Every so often someone from the crowd glanced toward the prisoners, but the looks no longer carried sharpness. Mostly curiosity now, sometimes even politeness. A teenage boy passed by holding 2 bottles of soda and stopped for a moment beside Emil Hartmann. "You folks really got castles over there?" he asked casually. Emil blinked in surprise at the question. "Yes," he answered carefully. "Many." The boy nodded with complete seriousness. "That is something." Then he wandered back toward the bleachers before anyone else could respond. Thomas shook his head under his breath. "Only in Texas," he muttered. Carl looked faintly amused. "Your people ask strange questions. You should hear the politicians," Thomas replied. For the first time that evening, Carl actually laughed. Not loudly, just a brief sound almost buried beneath the noise of the crowd. But it stopped Thomas cold anyway, because up until that moment, he had never imagined what laughter from a German prisoner might sound like. Nearby, Earl Cooper leaned against the fence sipping coffee from a dented tin cup while watching the interaction with quiet satisfaction. "Funny thing," Cooper said softly. "Most folks expect enemies to look different." Thomas glanced toward him. "Maybe they should." Cooper shrugged beneath the yellow floodlights. "Hard to hate somebody once you hear them laugh." The words lingered in Thomas's mind longer than he expected. Across the arena, another rider charged from the gate while the crowd roared approval. Dust exploded beneath the horse's hooves, glowing pale beneath the lights before drifting slowly toward the night sky. Somewhere beyond the fairgrounds, crickets hummed through the dry grass fields stretching for miles outside town. It would have been peaceful if not for the war sitting quietly between every conversation. A few minutes later, the rodeo paused briefly between events while workers reset equipment inside the arena. The crowd relaxed into easy chatter. Children climbed onto benches. Men stretched their backs. Women passed around paper trays loaded with pie and barbecue. Near the concession stand, a local photographer moved through the grounds carrying an old camera with a large flash attachment strapped to one shoulder. He stopped suddenly after noticing the unusual scene near the fence line. A group of American ranchers laughing beside German POWs beneath rodeo lights. "Hold still a second," the photographer called out instinctively. Thomas immediately frowned. Probably not a good idea. But before anyone could move away, the flash popped bright white across the night. For an instant, everything froze inside the light. Carl beside the fence. Emil holding a paper cup of coffee. Earl Cooper smiling faintly beneath his hat. Thomas standing among them instead of apart from them. The photographer lowered the camera with a satisfied grin. "Well," he said, "that is not something you see every day." Thomas expected Carl to object, maybe turn away. Instead, Carl stared toward the glowing arena for several seconds before speaking quietly. "In 20 years," he said softly, "people may not believe moments like this happened." Nobody answered immediately, because deep down, they all understood exactly what he meant. History usually remembered battles, generals, flags, victories. But nights like this disappeared quietly unless someone bothered to remember them. A warm breeze swept across the fairgrounds carrying the smell of dust and roasted peanuts through the air. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while chasing each other beneath strings of carnival lights. Thomas looked around slowly at the people filling the grounds. Farmers, cowboys, soldiers, prisoners, ordinary people sharing the same warm Texas night without fully understanding how unusual that really was. Then the announcer's voice thundered across the loudspeaker once more, calling the crowd back to attention for the final events of the evening. The bleachers erupted again with excitement, while arena gates rattled open beneath the floodlights. Carl rested both hands against the fence and watched the riders prepare in silence. After a long moment, he spoke without looking away from the arena. "Back home," he said quietly, "I almost forgot what normal sounded like." Thomas looked at the roaring crowd, the music drifting through the dust, the flags moving gently in the warm night breeze. Then he answered with surprising honesty. Maybe everybody did. The final events of the rodeo stretched deep into the night, while the Texas air slowly cooled around the fairgrounds. Dust settled softly over the wooden fences and parked trucks as the crowds began thinning little by little, though music still drifted through the grounds from an old speaker near the concession stand. The excitement had softened now into something quieter, slower. Families folded blankets. Cowboys loosened their collars beneath the floodlights. Children carried half-finished bags of popcorn while struggling to stay awake against their parents' shoulders. Near the livestock pens, the German prisoners remained beneath Thomas Reed's supervision, but the mood between them no longer felt guarded. The sharp edge from earlier had disappeared somewhere between the coffee cups, the laughter, and the long hours beneath the arena lights. Earl Cooper leaned against the fence with both thumbs hooked through his belt loops while watching workers close the holding gates for the night. "Well," he muttered with satisfaction. Looks like nobody burned the place down after all. Thomas smirked faintly. You sound disappointed. Not disappointed, Cooper replied. Just surprised how easy people forget they are supposed to hate each other. Nearby, Carl Weber watched a ranch hand lead a tired horse slowly toward a trailer while steam rose gently from the animal's back in the cool night air. Maybe people get tired of carrying hate everywhere, Carl said quietly. Cooper looked at him for a long second beneath the yellow floodlights. Son, you might understand Americans better than some Americans do. The old rancher motioned toward a group of folding tables near the barbecue pit, where several volunteers were still serving late meals to workers and performers. Come on, Cooper said. No sense standing around hungry. Thomas straightened immediately. Earl. Cooper waved him off without even looking. Relax, Sergeant. They have spent all evening surrounded by pies, brisket, and fried onions. That alone deserves mercy. Thomas hesitated only briefly before nodding once toward the prisoners. Stay together, he said, and no wandering. The Germans followed Cooper across the fairgrounds beneath strings of fading carnival lights, while music crackled softly through the speakers overhead. The smell of smoked brisket lingered thick in the cool air. At the long wooden tables, rodeo workers sat shoulder to shoulder eating late dinners from paper plates while swapping stories loud enough for half the county to hear. Nobody stopped talking when the prisoners approached. Nobody stared in silence either. A few people looked surprised. Most simply made room at the tables. Carl paused for half a second before sitting carefully at the edge of the bench. Emile sat beside him, still looking uncertain about the entire situation. One of the local women serving food stepped forward carrying a tray stacked high with sliced brisket and cornbread. You boys eat yet? She asked casually. Carl looked almost confused by the question itself. Not since afternoon, he admitted. Then you are late, the woman declared while dropping generous portions onto their plates. Texas waits for nobody. A few nearby ranchers laughed warmly at that. Thomas remained standing several feet away beneath the lights, arms folded loosely while watching the scene unfold. It felt unreal somehow. German POWs eating barbecue at a Texas rodeo while old cowboys debated cattle prices 2 seats away. The war suddenly seemed very far from Dawson County. One of the ranch hands sitting across from Carl pointed toward the arena while chewing slowly. So, he asked, what did you think of your first rodeo? Carl glanced toward the empty dirt ring glowing softly beneath the floodlights. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered honestly. Loud, he said. The table burst into laughter. Even Thomas smiled despite himself. Carl looked faintly embarrassed before continuing. But also, he searched for the right English word. Alive. The laughter softened into thoughtful silence after that, because everyone at the table understood exactly what he meant. For years now, the world had felt heavy. Newspapers filled with casualty lists. Families waiting beside radios. Young men disappearing overseas. Yet tonight, for a few hours beneath bright lights and drifting dust, ordinary people remembered what life sounded like before fear took over everything. Emile looked down at the plate in front of him almost like he still could not believe it was real. At home, he said carefully, we used to have festivals before the war. One older cowboy nodded slowly. World was probably better before everybody started arguing over flags. Nobody disagreed. A warm breeze moved through the fairgrounds carrying distant music across the dark Texas fields surrounding the rodeo grounds. The floodlights hummed overhead while coffee steamed from tin cups along the tables. Thomas watched Carl quietly thank the woman who refilled his coffee without hesitation. No bitterness. No speeches. Just tired men sharing food after a long evening. And standing there beneath the fading carnival lights, Thomas realized something that unsettled him more than anything else that night. He could no longer see where the line between enemy and ordinary man was supposed to be. By the time the last rodeo lights began shutting down one row at a time, the fairgrounds had grown quiet enough to hear the wind moving through the open Texas fields beyond town. The crowd slowly disappeared into the dark roads carrying folding chairs, sleepy children, and leftover pie wrapped in napkins. Pickup engines rumbled to life across the parking area, while dust drifted low beneath the fading yellow lights. Near the barbecue tables, the German prisoners helped stack empty coffee cups and fold chairs without being asked. Nobody ordered them to do it. They simply joined the work the same way everyone else had. Thomas Reed noticed that immediately. Carl Weber carried a crate of empty soda bottles toward the concession stand while Emil swept peanut shells from beneath one of the benches using an old push broom somebody handed him. The entire scene looked so ordinary it almost felt dangerous. Because war depended on distance, on keeping people divided into neat categories that made hatred easier to carry. But ordinary moments complicated everything. Earl Cooper stood near the smoker pit wiping his hands on a dish towel while watching the prisoners work alongside local ranch hands beneath the remaining lights. "You know," he muttered toward Thomas, "if somebody walked in right now, they would not know who was guarding who." Thomas gave a quiet breath through his nose that almost sounded like a laugh. "Maybe that is the problem." Cooper looked at him carefully. "No, son. Maybe that is the answer." The old rancher walked off before Thomas could respond. Nearby, the local photographer from earlier returned carrying a small envelope beneath his arm. "Developed quicker than I expected," he said proudly while pulling out a fresh black and white photograph. Thomas stepped closer. So did Carl. The image showed the exact moment from earlier beneath the rodeo lights. Thomas standing beside the prisoners near the fence. Earl Cooper smiling with a coffee cup in hand. Emil holding roasted peanuts. Carl staring toward the arena while dust drifted through the bright floodlights around them. Nobody in the photograph looked angry. Nobody looked afraid. They simply looked tired and human beneath the same Texas sky. The photographer smiled faintly while studying his own work. "Funny picture for wartime," he admitted. Carl looked at the photograph for several long seconds without speaking. Then his eyes settled on the floodlights frozen above them in the image. "No," he said softly. "Maybe this is exactly the kind of picture people will need after the war." The photographer slowly nodded. He folded the photograph carefully and handed it toward Thomas. "Keep it," he said. "Something tells me this one matters." Thomas accepted the picture without answering. A cool breeze moved across the nearly empty fairgrounds carrying the faint smell of smoke, coffee, and dust through the dark. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, crickets hummed steadily beneath the open sky. The rodeo grounds no longer felt loud now, just peaceful. The German prisoners gathered near the truck waiting for the ride back to camp while workers finished shutting down the final lights around the arena. Carl stood quietly beside the tailgate with both hands resting in his pockets, watching the empty dirt ring one last time. Thomas walked over beside him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. Finally, Thomas glanced toward the arena. "So," he said quietly, "what will you tell people about this night someday?" Carl looked out across the empty bleachers glowing faintly beneath the remaining lights. "Honestly," he answered, "I do not think anyone back home would believe me." Thomas smiled faintly at that. "Yeah, probably not." A few seconds passed before Carl spoke again, his voice softer now. "Before tonight, I thought Americans only saw us as enemies." Thomas kept his eyes on the arena. "Some still do." "Maybe," Carl admitted. "But not everyone." The words settled heavily into the cool night air. Because both men understood how rare that realization really was in the middle of a world war. Nearby, Emil climbed into the truck bed beside the other prisoners, while Earl Cooper finished locking the concession stand doors. The old rancher tipped his hat toward Carl before turning away into the darkness. No speeches, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet gesture beneath fading rodeo lights. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the photograph once more. Under the weak glow from the parking lamps, the image looked almost unreal. Cowboys, prisoners, coffee cups, dust. One strange, peaceful moment caught forever in black and white. Carl studied the picture beside him before speaking one final time. "You know what surprised me most tonight?" Thomas folded the photograph carefully. "What is that?" Carl looked toward the empty arena where the dust still moved gently beneath the last lights. "Nobody tried to make us feel small." Thomas did not answer right away, because deep down, he realized that might have been the most American thing about the entire night. The truck pulled away from the rodeo grounds just after midnight, while the last floodlights faded behind them one by one, leaving only the soft glow of distant farmhouses. Scattered across the Texas plains, dust followed the tires down the narrow road as warm night wind drifted through the wooden slats in the back of the transport truck. The German prisoners sat quietly along the benches, exhausted from the long evening, but the silence among them felt different now. Lighter somehow, less hollow. Emil Hartmann rested both arms on the side rail while staring back toward the disappearing lights of Dawson County. "I can still hear the music," he said softly. Carl Weber sat across from him, holding the folded photograph carefully inside his jacket pocket. "That means it was a good night," Carl answered. Up front, Sergeant Thomas Reed drove beneath an endless stretch of stars while the road cut through dark Texas farmland for miles in every direction. Earl Cooper's words still lingered in his mind. People stop acting like symbols and start acting like people again. Thomas tightened one hand against the steering wheel. He had spent most of the war believing distance made things easier. Enemy uniforms, enemy language, enemy flags. But tonight had complicated all of that. Because once a man shared coffee with you beneath rodeo lights, or laughed at a bad joke, or quietly thanked someone for cornbread, it became harder to fit him neatly inside the word enemy. The truck rattled over a wooden bridge while crickets hummed loudly through the fields below. Behind Thomas, the prisoners spoke quietly among themselves in German, their tired voices blending with the steady sound of the engine. For once, Thomas did not mind not understanding every word. Some conversations deserved privacy. Nearly 40 minutes later, the prison camp finally appeared ahead beneath dim security lights rising from the darkness like a small, lonely island in the middle of the plains. Guard towers stood silent against the night sky, while rows of barracks stretched across the dry earth behind wire fencing. The moment the truck rolled through the gate, the feeling from the rodeo seemed to fade slightly beneath the hard outlines of camp life returning around them. Still, something had changed. Thomas could feel it. The prisoners climbed down slowly from the truck bed beneath. The yellow lamps, boots against gravel, quiet breathing, tired shoulders. Before heading toward the barracks, Carl paused beside the truck while the others continued ahead. Thomas stepped down from the cab and looked toward him. Neither man spoke immediately. The night air smelled faintly of dust and engine oil now, instead of barbecue smoke and coffee. Yet the silence between them remained calm. Carl reached into his jacket and carefully removed the folded photograph from earlier. He looked at it one more time beneath the weak camp lights before handing it toward Thomas. "You keep it," Carl said quietly. Thomas frowned slightly. "Thought the photographer gave it to me already." Carl nodded once. "Yes, but now I am giving it to you too." Thomas accepted the photograph slowly without looking away from him. For a few seconds neither man seemed sure what else needed saying. Then Carl glanced back toward the dark outline of the rodeo grounds barely visible somewhere beyond the distant hills. "Tonight," he said softly, "I almost forgot there was a war." The honesty in his voice caught Thomas off guard. Because the truth was, he had nearly forgotten too. Not completely, but enough to remember what ordinary life used to feel like before newspapers and casualty lists became part of every morning. Thomas folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Get some sleep, Weber," he said quietly. Carl nodded once before turning toward the barracks. Halfway there, Emil suddenly looked back toward Thomas from the dirt path. "Sergeant." Thomas raised his eyes. Emil hesitated before speaking. "Thank you for letting us see America this way." Then he disappeared into the darkness beside the others. Thomas stood alone beside the truck long after the prisoners entered the barracks. The Texas wind moved softly across the camp fences while distant coyotes called somewhere beyond the fields. Slowly, he removed the photograph once more beneath the yellow security light. Cowboys, prisoners, coffee cups, dust floating beneath rodeo lights. One strange, peaceful moment captured forever in black and white. Years later, long after the war ended, the photograph still hung inside Earl Cooper's old roadside diner outside Dawson County. The edges eventually curled with age. The black and white image slowly faded beneath decades of sunlight and cigarette smoke. But people still asked about it sometimes. And every single time, Earl told them the same thing while pouring coffee beneath the old ceiling fan. That night reminded everybody of something important. He would say quietly, "The quiet ones were never the people we should have feared.